Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our midweek NBA power rankings, as always, we want to remind you yet again that if you wish to contribute and interact to our shows, as well as my own and those around the network, more directly consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcsportsnetwork.net, to either leave opinions, feedback, inputs for our show, but as well as tips and donations, though they're genuinely appreciated as well. They just make our show that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to it. But without further ado, let's jump right into our midweek NBA power rankings, see if there is any change to the top, even though the top 5 has been little more than really stagnant at this point. We know who the core 5 teams right now in the NBA are, the teams that should be competing for the Larry O'Brien Trophy come June. But ultimately, we could see a couple moves in the coming weeks as teams in both conferences continuously improve. But for now, I still think it remains chalk at the top. But if you have any feedback, input, any qualms with this list at all, do consider leaving a comment. As always, it is greatly appreciated, and I love hearing your opinions as well. They ultimately inform my own, as well as I don't necessarily watch the NBA as much as I would like to. So if you have any interesting stats or facts to update me on, I will gladly oblige them and talk about them as well. But without further ado, let's jump right into our midweek NBA power rankings, starting off at number 5, potentially one of the hottest teams in the league for who they've beaten, considering the fact that they've beaten the Cleveland Cavaliers twice in the past 2 weeks, and the Boston Celtics, both top Eastern Conference standings teams in terms of where they rank and in terms of form as well. How about them Houston Rockets? And it's not necessarily who they've beaten, why they've beaten them, but how they've beaten them. They are tied with the Phoenix Suns for the most clutch victories in the NBA. In their past 11 games, they won 10 of their past 12 of them. And then, in terms of road performance as well, they won 10 of their last 11 on the road. And I really like how that sounds if I'm a Houston Rockets fan. Not only beating the teams you could likely be competing against come the postseason, and you're going to have to continue beating them because you have 2 games against Memphis and New York in terms of the span of 2 weeks, but ultimately how they're doing it as well with this rotation. And one player I really want to highlight is my potential Rookie of the Year, Amen Thompson. Truly special player. In 3 of their past 6 games has scored 20-plus points, really being one of the most clutch performances evidenced by his game-winning shot against Boston on the road, 1 of their 10 road victories in their past 11. So I do think that this Houston Rockets team is capable of anything. They just have to believe that they can outscore anybody. They truly are one of the best offenses in the entire league. And at this point, they're not necessarily creeping up on anyone anymore. We know that the Houston Rockets, every single game, no matter who they play, will come to battle. And that's a scary proposition for the rest of the Western Conference and the rest of the NBA for that matter, as this Houston Rockets team is built to last. So they sit at number 5 with potential movement in the coming weeks to the top 3, maybe potentially to the top 2 to come potentially for this very talented Houston Rockets team, should they continue as they have been. Then at number 4, a team that, yes, suffered a very tough road setback against the New York Knicks, but had won 6 in a row up to that point. I feel like this Memphis Grizzlies team, though, is very defined in how they want to play. Jaren Jackson is becoming a bit more of a go-to scorer to compensate for Ja Morant in terms of the inside-outside development with them, and they really have been getting a bit stronger in terms of who they can play in the front court, having a rotation of guys who can play multiple positions, whether it be the 4 or the 5, like Edey, like Brandon Clark, like Jay Huff, and really kind of accommodating for the play of Ja Morant as well. Because if Ja Morant continues to be the dynamic player we know him to be, it is paramount that they get production out of their front court, and they've been doing that very well, but it's just going up against these physical teams, right? Going up against teams like the Knicks, going up against teams in their own conference, like the Thunder and the Rockets, who they'll have to play tomorrow night, and who have already beaten them 3 times this season. So it's going to be important for Memphis to continue to develop that front court to better build around a guy like Ja Morant who can explode at any certain moment. But ultimately, I feel like they're good enough to compete in the Western Conference, but they just need to prove it against the teams they might be facing come the postseason. So that's where I kind of stand on Memphis. This is a team that can move many different ways. They can move up this list, and they can certainly move off this list. But I just feel like right now they're a team coming into their own, and that could be an interesting proposition as the season plays out. Then at number 3, a team seemingly in a bit of a quote-unquote crisis mode. As a fan of this team, I'm not necessarily completely panicking, but I am worried at their play. The Boston Celtics. This is an interesting team, right? Because they are so reliant on the three-point shot. They are so reliant on the depth of this team. But ultimately, the record over the past 2 months does not show what this team is capable of. They're only 13-11 since December 7th. So as you can see, they're definitely kind of faltering in key moments throughout the season. Yes, they have a chance to recuperate after the All-Star break, potentially add a couple depth pieces, and we talked about that yesterday. We'll talk about it continuously next week about how they can add to this team. But ultimately, they have to work with what they got as well. But ultimately, another interesting thing is that they're still in the top 10 in a lot of important statistics. They're still 8th in total offense, 4th in defense, and 3rd in net rating. So they're not playing completely poorly. It's just that I feel like this team isn't necessarily as motivated as you would thought they would be at this juncture in the season. But considering the fact that if you look at all the events of the offseason for this Boston Celtics team, Jason Tatum not necessarily playing as often in the Paris Olympics, this whole debate about whether or not JT and JB will be elite players even with this championship. All this white noise could be disturbing them at the moment, but they're still, at this point in the season, the 2nd seed in the Eastern Conference standings. So, while they could potentially slide out of these rankings if this blip continues, I still think that this is certainly a team capable of kicking it into high gear and getting back into a rhythm. It's just that some of that white noise might be seeping into their minds a little bit at this juncture of the season. They're waiting for the All-Star break to arrive, and then after, we potentially see a newer, improved Celtics for the 2024-25 postseason. Then at number 2, the Cleveland Cavaliers. An interesting story with the Cleveland Cavaliers. To start the season, they needed 20 games to accumulate 3 losses. For the first time this season, they found themselves in a 3-game losing streak last week. They were against very solid teams, mind you, but it was their first 3-game losing streak of the season. That's still a very impressive stat, the fact that the Cleveland Cavaliers have not lost 3 games consecutively all season long until then, and it took them 20 games to find their first 3 losses. But I do feel like in those 3 losses, they still played like the Cleveland Cavaliers with just untimely errors or late game rallies that came up short that kept them down. For example, in their game against the Rockets, they had to rally from a 17-point deficit late in the 4th. Against the Embiid-less 76ers, they just couldn't keep up with them, and Ty Jerome's career performance ultimately wasn't enough. And then again, against the Rockets a couple weeks ago, Darius Garland misses a couple clutch free throws with limited time left that would have seen them win that game. So it's not like Cleveland is playing badly. And it's not like, this 3-game losing streak could become a trend for them. And they did pick up a nice win against Detroit last night in kind of a respite game. But ultimately, I feel like this Cleveland Cavaliers team is playing with house money. No one expected them to be the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference standings midway through the season. So ultimately, when we view a 3-game losing streak for the Cleveland Cavaliers now compared to when they were constantly winning, it could be a little worrisome, but not to me, because I still believe in this Cleveland team. They continue to be the best team in the Eastern Conference. But they're not beating out the number 1 seed just yet, the Oklahoma City Thunder. Now, we can talk about the exploits of SGA, leading the league in scoring, and in terms of his defensive prowess being 4th in steals. But I want to talk about how they line up, how they rotate this squad. Isaiah Hartenstein, as you all know, was facing an injury over the past couple of games, a high ankle sprain. Came back, had a great performance last night, contributed on both ends of the floor. When Isaiah Hartenstein plays for Oklahoma City, they are 23-2. Combine that with Chet Holmgren, I'm checking the stats here, 4 of their 8 losses have come when both of them miss time. So as you can see, I feel like this team is very, very loaded in the front court. Because even without both of them, 2 guys who can impact games both ways, I feel like this Oklahoma City team does not care. Now that they're 500 without 2 of the better depth, the big men in the league, I feel like that tells you a lot about how this team is performing. Because it's not just SGA. And if it was, then it would be very Denver Nuggets-like. But I do feel like it's very telling that when these 2 big men come together, this OKC team is perhaps the toughest team to beat in the league. And even without them, they could still very well be the toughest team to beat in the league because of that depth. So I just wanted to present to you that interesting stat about OKC and how tough it is to beat them when both of these guys are playing, especially when Hartenstein is available, because he was a very, very important acquisition this offseason for them and really helping them in terms of depth. But let me know what you think about these rankings in the comments below, because coming next, we continue looking at what could be next for certain CFP teams, and this time around we're looking at perhaps the most shocking CFP team this season, the Arizona State Sun Devils, from zero to hero, picked last in many Big 12 preseason polls. Could they potentially have an even better 2025 after losing one of the best players in their history? We'll be right back after the break to talk about that as well.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube.